That's Marco D'Amico. Follow him at MND'Amico on all your favorite socials, joining us as he does every week right here on the Shaun Starr Show at YouTube.com. Don't forget, you can get all your favorite Shaun Starr gear, whether it's a two-tone hat, whether it's this 11-ounce ceramic dishwasher microwavable mug at theshaunstarrshow.com. And we've partnered with Le Delivery Guy for free local deliveries. Order before 2 p.m. weekdays. You'll get it that day thanks to Le Delivery Guy. Is Nick Suzuki a 1C? Is Nick Suzuki a top 10 center in hockey? Is Nick Suzuki top 25 centerman in hockey? Some Toronto fanboys had some fun with this last week. Nick Kypreos and Bourne and those guys going over Nick Suzuki and whether or not the Montreal Canadiens can find a path to championship glory with number 14 occupying the 1C role. That got a lot of Hab fans, raised a lot of eyebrows in this market. You know, when I look at Nick Suzuki, I can understand that, you know, he doesn't possess explosive speed. I've spoken about this often. Nick Suzuki to me is like the ace of my staff. You know what makes a great pitcher, the ace of a staff? You work on his time. Sometimes when I watch Nick Suzuki, if he wants to go faster, you'll go faster. If he wants to slow it down deliberately, he can do that. He's a cerebral, high hockey IQ player from my observations. Yeah. Unfortunately, though, sometimes I see Toronto boys, they're really focused on the biggest, richest market in hockey. And sometimes teams like Edmonton or Vancouver or Calgary or Montreal and Ottawa, they're on the periphery. And because they're not Austin Matthews or Connor McDavid and they don't look the part, they don't get spoken about the way those guys get spoken about, as they should. We're talking about the 1% of the 1%. Nick Suzuki, for me, is a number one center. No dispute, no argument. I think he's a great leader on top of all of that. Marco, what was your reaction when you saw that opinion? And walk me through, you're in the weeds on all things NHL. Walk me through Nick Suzuki's place among centermen in the NHL today.
Listen, I think, there's many ways of going about this in terms of your analysis. You can look at pure stats, you can look at two-way game, you can look at importance to a team. Let's run down the top. Let's go through the exercise, because I don't want to sit here and bash Nick and all those guys. You know, for the record, they backpedaled pretty hard right after that was said. It's unfortunate.
I'll give Bourne credit. He did walk it back. Yes.
That clip is very unfortunate. But what I will say is, do I think that Nick Suzuki is more than a top 25 center in this league? Absolutely. Do I think that Nick Suzuki is a number one center? Without a shadow of a doubt. The only thing I will say is, let us run down the list and you tell me, okay?
Yes.
Nathan McKinnon, number one center.
Yes.
Leon Draisaitl, not really a center. Right? Like mostly right wing, sometimes plays center. So let's just throw him a bone and say he's a center. Connor McDavid, he's a center. Jack Eichel, he's a center. Sidney Crosby, he's a center. How Sidney Crosby has 76 points in 69 games? Beyond me. But
he's a Mount Rushmore player, bro. He's a Mount Rushmore player.
Mark Scheifele, number one center.
Yeah.
Martin Nietzsche's not a center.
Right.
That is a winger, no matter how hard he tries to pigeonhole, with a 38% face-off percentage. And the fact that they're playing him on the wing right now, despite it having been a need, it forced them to spend big money to go and get a number two center. So that should tell you everything you need to know about Martin Nietzsche's, not a number one center.
Yeah.
Sam Reinhart is a winger. Right? And I'm just going down the list of top center scorers in the NHL right now. Nick Suzuki is 9th after that with 71 points in 68 games. Granted, if you were to go with points per game, Jack Hughes, terrible in the face-off circle, unfortunately. Yeah. But in my opinion, is a number one center. Is he
agreed?
Maybe like a Matt Barzal that probably would be a winger if there were a real number one center? Yes, but for the intents and purposes of everything outside of the face-off circle, to me, he is a number one center that distributes the puck at an elite level. So I would put him above Nick Suzuki in that same category. Tim Stützle, same kind of scenario for me. Although Nick does have more points than him, I would consider Tim Stützle to be a superior number one center.
Agreed.
And with the most minor of differences, but we're talking about a player that's younger than Suzuki that has hit 90 points.
Well, that I was going to say, like, I really like Nick Suzuki. He has a lot of value, so I don't want
Yeah.
this to be misinterpreted as disrespectful.
No.
But
But
like when you bring up
people,
Tim Stutzla for a second,
yeah,
I see potential superstar. Jack Hughes, I see potential superstar.
well, he
Nick
is.
Suzuki, I see star player. I think he's a star player. I don't know if he has that potential to level up to be Tim
Mm,
Stutzla 90 plus points. And
I,
for me,
I
that's the
think
separation.
on the record, I think Nick Suzuki has 90-point seasons in him.
Well, he's on pace for 86 this year. So what's
Yeah,
4 more points? Yeah,
he's
for
on
sure.
pace for
Yeah.
86 this year. Once
Yeah.
again, playing on a one-line team. You know,
Where Slavkovsky missed half the season.
well, I mean, yes, but without being disrespectful to Slavkovsky in this case, but like, yeah,
No, but when
um,
Slavkovsky hits, Marco, that's how Nick Suzuki gets to those points. Like when Slavkovsky figures
no,
out how to be more consistent,
I think it has
right?
even, Slavkovsky. Sure, it could be Slavkovsky, it could be Demidov, it could be Line, it could be whatever.
Yeah.
To me is when you drop a game plan against the Montreal Canadiens, Nick Suzuki is your game plan.
Right.
Your job as an NHL like defense core is to shut down Nick Suzuki. If you can stop Nick Suzuki, up until I would say this year with Cole Caulfield has been phenomenal as an individual player this year in terms of
Yes.
how he's evolved. So we'll get to him in a sec, but the plan was always limit Nick Suzuki, limit the Canadiens. It was a one-line team. He was always facing the best. And that is one of the main reasons why the Canadiens are double shifting Nick Suzuki on the power play, for example, or when there's 5 minutes left in a game and they're shortening the bench and they're putting him, second shift every 3 rotations. He's got 2 shifts. There's a reason for that. He's just absolutely elite workhorse kind of center. And, when you look at, and I was just going down the list here, the only other center in the league right now that I would truly, put higher than him that isn't there is Austin Matthews in the top 10 in scoring. So to me, you can easily make the argument, Nick Suzuki's a top 10 center. I think he's very much in the conversation for top 10 center. If he doesn't make it, then he's like 11, 12, or 13.
Right.
But he's very much in that conversation. So the only thing I will say is if you look at all these number 1 centers, Nathan MacKinnon is the only exception to this rule. But they all have a well-rounded team.
Yes.
And the only reason I say Nathan MacKinnon is an exception to the rule is simply because the team he started the season with versus the team he has now are 2 completely different entities. If you look at it, the goaltending has changed. Their top 9 has basically been swapped out. There's been so much volatility. Where you look at Sidney Crosby has Evgeny Malkin playing behind him. So that's a pretty solid 1-2 punch. Connor McDavid has Leon Draisaitl. And then Nugent Hopkins is nothing to sneeze at, on the second or third line.
That's a good point.
Jack Eichel's got a pretty solid center line playing behind him as well. With Hertl and Carlson. The same goes with Jack Hughes. He doesn't have the major defensive responsibilities that a Nick Suzuki would have because he's got Hischier playing behind him.
Exactly.
The same thing could apply to a guy like Braden Point and Anthony Cirelli, right? Cirelli helps the process when it comes to Point. Point's still an 80 to 90 point player every single season, but you get my drift. You look at a guy like Sebastian Aho, and all of a sudden he's under a point per game this season. Why is that? Well, because they don't have the depth in Carolina that they used to, right? So it becomes a whole lot easier to hone in on that one guy when it comes to these matchups. Nick Suzuki, and on top of being an Ironman, I don't mean to kick tires here, but I don't want to go too far in the sense of critiquing him, but I don't want to go too far in the sense of praising him. But Nick Suzuki, out of most of the centers in the top 15, probably has, up until Stutzla was gifted Dylan Cousins, probably the hardest matchup scenario out of any of the centers in the top.
That I agree with. Do you see seriously? Like we always try to tell it like it is, good or bad. That's the way to do it.
Suzuki's offensive numbers will take off with 2 things: an elite second winger to play on his line, be it Slavkovsky developing into that, or Demidov taking his place.
Right.
And an established number 2 center. right? So the way that I see it is like Austin Matthews is just an elite, phenomenal talent. And for all the shit, excuse my language, that John Tavares gets, what a
Yep.
load off he gives to a guy like
Great point.
Austin Matthews, right? Like
Great
if
point.
if
Yep.
John Tavares didn't get injured in the first game against the Canadiens in 2021 in the playoffs, what a different series that would have been. The matchup changed entirely, and it became all about honing in on Matthews, and that's how the Canadiens were able to really kind of shut them down in the last couple of games. It was actually, in fact, Jason Spezza at the time before his retirement that actually had to step up in the in the event of the injury to Tavares, where he was the kind of difference maker as a secondary scoring option. Well, that is exactly what Nick Suzuki has lacked, is that ability to have someone else step up in the center role to make the matchup situation far more difficult on teams, especially on the road. And I think that's where it's very difficult for a guy like Nick Suzuki. And we don't take that in our analysis. But when you do take that into the analysis and you do look at what he's done, he is on pace to be the first center for the Montreal Canadiens since what, 96, to be a point per game player.
Yep.
So
correct. Yep.
Again,
and climbing.
So I think there's 90 points in his future. I really, really do. I just, unfortunately, as he's entered his prime, he's played on, borderline terrible rosters. Like,
For sure.
For sure,
man. You saw those rosters that are out there online last week.
Yeah,
Len
the
Pitlick
roster
and Denny
from 2023,
Gurianov.
Yeah. So this is the thing I'm trying to say. You look at all these other guys playing with like legitimate top 6 players. I mean, Nick Suzuki does now, obviously, but I don't think that you could really claim that Slafkovsky played like a legitimate top 6 player for the first half of the season. No. I think he's playing like one right now. Yeah, I think he's playing like one right now, and credit to him, and hopefully he finds that consistency. But the Canadiens, again, were like Patrick Laine was out for the first 2 months and then had bouts with viruses that seemingly took him out for weeks at a time. Nick, Kirby Dach is having his own adventure and so on and so forth. Like no one was all systems go other than Nick Suzuki and Cole Caulfield this season. At forward.
That's Marco D'Amico. You can follow him at rg.org, MN D'Amico on all your favorite socials all over the Montreal Canadiens here. Marco D'Amico, always a treat. Just the best stuff as always. Follow him online at MN D'Amico. Marco, thanks. And we'll catch up again next week for another exciting week of Habs content. Let's see where this roller coaster ride takes us. Marco, thank you, brother.
Always a pleasure, guys.